The Appalachian Mountains had a way of holding on to secrets. Hidden beneath the blanket of fog that settled over the rolling peaks, there were stories. Old stories, the kind that outlived those who told them. The people who lived in these mountains knew them well, passing them down like heirlooms, each generation adding a little something more to the legends. But one story always came with the same warning: never visit the wishing tree. Henry had heard the tale since he was a boy, sitting on his grandfather's knee while the fire crackled in the hearth. The old man would lean close, his voice a raspy whisper, telling him about the hollow oak that stood deep in the forest. It was no ordinary tree, he'd say. If you found it and whispered your deepest desire into the hollow, it would grant your wish. But there was always a price to pay. People went missing in these mountains. That wasn't news. Sometimes it was the wild animals. Sometimes it was the bitter winters or the fast-rising rivers. But sometimes, just sometimes, folks would vanish after seeking out the tree. They were warned. Everyone was. Yet, every so often, desperation made people ignore warnings. Henry never thought he would be one of them. But grief changes a man. It takes what you think you know about yourself and twists it into something else. Since Mary had died, the days had turned into a blur, each one bleeding into the next. The cabin that once felt warm and alive with her laughter had become a cold tomb. Her absence was like a weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. She had died bringing their child into the world, but the baby had only lived for a few minutes, leaving him with nothing but silence. For months, Henry wandered the mountains aimlessly, searching for answers he knew he'd never find. He thought about leaving, packing up, heading west like so many others had. But something kept him tethered to these hills, as if the roots of the place had dug into his soul. It was during one of these aimless walks that he overheard the locals talking about the wishing tree again, their voices hushed but carrying in the still mountain air. "I heard old man Connors went looking for it after his boy got sick," one of them said. "You think he found it?" "Who knows," another replied. "But I wouldn't be surprised. People get desperate, they'll do anything. But if he found it, he ain't coming back." Those words lingered in Henry's mind for days. Desperation. He understood it. He lived with it, day in and day out. He began to wonder, began to let the idea fester in the back of his mind. What if? What if the legend was true? What if he could find the tree and make things right again? He didn't believe in magic, not really. But grief doesn't care about logic. It doesn't care about reason. It just drives you to the edge of what you think is possible, and then it pushes you over. One cold evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, Henry made his decision. He would find the wishing tree. He would ask for Mary back. Maybe it was foolish, maybe it was dangerous, but he had to try. The locals said the tree was hidden deep in the forest, in a place where few dared to go. It wasn't on any map, and no one could tell you exactly how to find it. They said it revealed itself only to those who truly needed it. Henry took that as a sign. He set out the next morning, leaving his cabin behind with nothing but the clothes on his back and the weight of his grief pushing him forward. The forest was dense, the paths unfamiliar. Henry had grown up in these mountains, but this was different. It was as if the woods themselves had shifted, rearranging to confuse him, to make sure he stayed lost. For hours he wandered deeper and deeper, the trees growing thicker, their branches twisting in strange shapes. The air felt heavier, colder, and a strange silence settled over everything, as though the forest itself was watching him. Then, just as dusk began to fall, he saw it. The wishing tree. It stood alone in a small clearing, its ancient trunk gnarled and twisted like the hands of something old and forgotten. The hollow at its center was large enough for a man to crawl inside, though the thought sent a shiver down Henry's spine. The tree didn't look like any oak he had ever seen. Its bark was dark and rough, almost like stone, and the air around it seemed to hum with an energy he couldn't explain. For a moment, Henry hesitated. The stories came rushing back to him. Stories of people who made wishes and never returned, of lives ruined by the tree's twisted magic. But what choice did he have? He had nothing left to lose. Slowly, he approached the hollow, his heart pounding in his chest. He knelt before the ancient oak, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. The hollow seemed to pulse, as if it were alive, waiting for him to speak. He took a deep breath, closing his eyes. "Bring her back," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Bring Mary back to me." For a long moment, nothing happened. The forest remained still, the tree unmoving. Henry opened his eyes, half expecting the hollow to remain just an empty hole in the ancient bark. But as he stood there, a strange chill crept over him. The air grew colder, the wind picking up and swirling around the clearing. It was subtle at first, just a whisper in the breeze, but soon it became a howling wind, as if the forest itself was answering him. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the wind stopped. The woods fell silent again, the air heavy and still. The wishing tree stood before him, unchanged. For a long time, Henry stood there, waiting for something, anything, to happen. But there was only silence. He sighed, his heart heavy with disappointment. Perhaps it had all been a lie, a foolish legend. He turned away from the tree and began the long walk back to his empty cabin, unsure of what to expect when he returned. 3 days later, Mary came home. It was late, long past the time when visitors came calling. The chill of an early winter had settled over the mountains, and the wind howled through the cracks in Henry's cabin, rattling the windows. He sat alone by the fire, nursing a glass of whiskey, letting the burn in his throat distract him from the emptiness inside. The knock at the door was soft at first, barely audible over the wind. Henry frowned, thinking it might be a branch tapping against the wood. Then it came again, louder this time, deliberate. He set his glass down, his heart already pounding in his chest. No one came out this way, not at this hour, not in this weather. The only ones who visited now were memories and ghosts. The knock came a third time, slow and rhythmic, each tap like a heartbeat against the door. Henry stood, the hair on the back of his neck standing on end. His feet felt heavy as he crossed the room, an unfamiliar dread settling over him. His hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment, as if opening it would invite something dark into his home. But he had to know. With a deep breath, he twisted the knob and pulled the door open. Standing in the pale light of the moon was Mary. Henry's mind couldn't process what he was seeing. His first instinct was disbelief, his rational mind screaming that it wasn't possible. But there she stood, her face bathed in the cold glow of the moonlight, her eyes wide and searching. Her hair hung limp and lifeless around her face, and her skin was pale, too pale. "Mary," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible. He reached out, his hand trembling as if afraid to touch her, afraid she might disappear the moment he did. His fingers brushed her cold skin, and she didn't vanish. She was real. She was here. "I'm back," she said, her voice a faint echo of the one he had loved. Henry felt tears burn in his eyes, and before he knew what he was doing, he pulled her into his arms. She felt fragile, as though she might break if he held her too tightly, but she didn't pull away. She stood there, stiff and silent, as he clung to her. For a moment, it didn't matter that something felt wrong. It didn't matter that she was colder than the night air, that her body felt rigid and unnatural in his embrace. She was back. That was all he had wanted, all he had asked for. After what felt like an eternity, Henry stepped back, taking her in. She was still beautiful, still Mary, but something was different. Her eyes, once so full of warmth and life, now seemed empty, like glass marbles reflecting the light without really seeing him. Her lips, which had always been quick to smile, were pressed into a thin, unmoving line. She didn't move, didn't blink, didn't react. I don't understand, Henry stammered, his joy starting to mix with confusion. How? Mary's gaze flickered, but only for a second. I'm here now, she said, her voice flat, emotionless. That's what matters. Henry swallowed hard, a knot of unease forming in his chest. He wanted to believe that this was what he had wished for, that Mary had returned to him whole and unchanged. But the woman standing before him, wearing his wife's face, felt like a shadow, like something distant, something hollow. Come inside, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You must be cold. She nodded, stepping across the threshold. Henry watched as she moved stiffly, as if her body was unfamiliar to her, as if she was unused to walking. Her footsteps were slow and deliberate, each one an effort. She sat down in the chair by the fire, staring at the flames, but there was no warmth in her expression. It was as though the fire was nothing more than an image on a distant horizon, something she couldn't feel. Henry tried to shake off the growing unease. He busied himself making tea, hoping that warmth would bring the life back to her pale skin. But as he watched her sit there, still and quiet, he couldn't shake the sense that something was wrong. Deeply wrong. When he brought her the tea, she barely looked at it, letting it sit untouched on the table beside her. Henry sat across from her, staring at her, searching her face for some sign of the woman he had loved. He wanted to ask her questions, but he was afraid of what her answers might be. Do you remember? Henry finally asked, his voice tentative. What happened? She blinked, slow and deliberate, as if the question had taken time to reach her. I was gone, she said simply, her voice devoid of feeling. But now I'm here. Henry nodded, though her answer left him cold. He tried again, desperate to connect with her, to understand. But how? How did you come back? This time, Mary didn't answer. She just stared at the fire, her eyes fixed on the dancing flames, her face expressionless. It was as if the question didn't matter to her, as if the how and the why were beyond her concern. She was here. That was all that mattered. For the next few days, Mary remained in the cabin, moving like a ghost through the rooms that had once been full of life. She ate little, and when she did, it was with a mechanical precision, as if the act of eating was something she performed out of habit rather than hunger. At night, Henry would wake to find her standing by the window, staring out into the forest with those hollow eyes. She never spoke unless spoken to, and even then her answers were clipped, distant. Henry wanted to believe it was just an adjustment. She had been gone for so long, perhaps she was still coming back to herself. But as the days turned into weeks, the hope that had flickered in him began to dim. She wasn't getting better. She wasn't becoming more like the Mary he had known. If anything, she was becoming more distant, more inhuman. The neighbors began to notice too. When word got out that Mary had returned, they came by, curious and cautious. But their curiosity quickly turned to fear. The few who visited never stayed long, their eyes darting nervously between Henry and Mary, their voices hushed. They knew the stories, knew what the wishing tree could do. And though they never said it outright, Henry could see the fear in their eyes when they looked at her. The whispers started soon after. Henry could hear them when he went to town for supplies, the locals speaking in low voices behind his back. He wasn't welcome anymore. They didn't say it, but he could feel it. Whatever he had brought back with him, it wasn't natural. It wasn't right. But still he clung to the hope that somewhere, deep inside, his Mary was still there. She had to be. He had wished for her. He had asked for her, begged for her. She had come back. That meant something, didn't it? One night, unable to sleep, Henry found himself sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. Mary was standing by the window again, her back to him, her body as still as stone. He couldn't take it anymore. He had to know what was happening, what he had brought back with him. Slowly, He rose and made his way to the old family chest where Mary had kept her journals. She had always been a writer, filling page after page with her thoughts and dreams. Henry hadn't had the heart to look at them since she had passed, but now he needed to remember who she had been. He needed to find her again, even if it was only in her words. He opened the chest and pulled out the journals, the leather worn and cracked from years of use. As he flipped through the pages, his heart ached at the familiar handwriting, the small notes she had left herself, the reminders of the life they had shared. But it wasn't until he reached the final journal that he found something he hadn't expected. Tucked between the pages was an old piece of paper, yellowed with age. The handwriting wasn't Mary's. It was older, rougher, scrawled in shaky letters. As Henry read the words, a chill ran down his spine. The wishing tree is not to be trusted. It takes more than it gives. Henry stared at the note, his heart pounding in his chest. It wasn't a warning, it was a confession. What had he brought back? The firelight flickered in the cabin, casting long shadows that danced along the wooden walls. Henry sat at the table, the journal open before him, his breath coming in slow, shallow gasps. His fingers traced the edge of the paper, the faded words sinking deeper into his mind with each passing second. The wishing tree is not to be trusted. It takes more than it gives. The handwriting was shaky, rushed, as though written in a moment of panic. It wasn't Mary's. It couldn't be. The paper was old, far older than any journal Mary had kept. The ink had bled into the yellowed pages, the words faded but still legible, a dark reminder of something long forgotten. Henry's eyes darted to the window where Mary stood. Her back was to him, as always, her silhouette bathed in the soft glow of moonlight. She hadn't moved in hours, her body stiff, still as a statue, her reflection barely visible in the glass. The woman standing there looked like his wife, her frame, her hair, even the shape of her face in profile. But she was a shell. He knew it now, could feel it in his bones. The truth clawed at the edge of his mind, and the note in his hand only confirmed what he had been too afraid to admit. This thing wasn't Mary. With a shudder, Henry tore his gaze from her and turned back to the journal. There had to be more. He flipped through the brittle pages, each one filled with the delicate, looping handwriting of mountain settlers long gone. The stories were all the same. People desperate, people broken, searching for salvation in the hollow oak. Wishes whispered into the ancient tree, hopes carved into the bark with trembling hands. But the stories never ended well. July 3rd, 1834. I found it, the wishing tree. Lord forgive me, I was foolish. I thought it could save us. My son was sick. Fever had taken him, left him weak and pale. The doctor said there was nothing to be done, that I should make peace with it. But I couldn't. I couldn't let him go. I begged the tree to save him. I whispered my wish into its hollow, just as the stories said. And it did. My boy woke the next morning, strong, full of life. But something is wrong. He smiles, but it's not his smile. He looks at me, but his eyes, they don't recognize me. He's different. He's wrong. I've made a terrible mistake. Henry's hands trembled as he read, the words blurring before his eyes. He knew that kind of desperation, the kind that gnawed at your soul, made you do things you swore you never would. The settlers had all felt it, just as he had. They had turned to the wishing tree in their darkest moments, seeking miracles, just as he had. But the tree, whatever force lived within it, had taken their wishes and twisted them, turning their hopes into something monstrous. Henry's throat tightened as he read on, story after story of settlers who had asked for more than they could ever repay. October 12th, 1849. I wished for wealth. I thought it would bring us happiness, that it would end our struggles. The next day, I found gold in the creek near our home, more than I could carry. first, it seemed a miracle. We had everything we needed, everything we could ever want. But with the gold came sickness. My wife's skin grew pale, her breath labored. Then my children fell ill one by one. The doctors couldn't help. No one could. They're all gone now, every last one of them. I have the gold. I have everything I wished for, but I am alone. March 9th, 1856. I wished for youth, for beauty. I was a vain fool. At first, it worked. I was young again, my skin smooth, my hair thick and lustrous. But the change didn't stop. My skin grew tight, too tight. My bones ached as though they were shrinking inside me. Then my hands, they began to change. They turned to bark, my skin splitting open, revealing the wood beneath. I'm becoming something else, something not human. I can hear the tree in my dreams, calling me back to it. I don't have much time left. I'm losing myself. Soon I'll be nothing but a part of it. The pages were filled with warnings, desperate confessions of those who had bargained with the wishing tree and lost. Each entry painted the same picture. The tree granted wishes, but it twisted them into nightmares. It took from those who sought it, piece by piece, until nothing of the original person remained. Henry's heart pounded in his chest as he reached the last entry, written in the same shaky hand that had scrawled the note. April 22nd, 1873, I made the wish. I begged for her to come back. My wife, she died last winter, and the grief hollowed me out. I thought I could bear it, thought I could live with the pain, but I was wrong. The loneliness drove me mad. I went to the tree. I asked it to bring her back. It did, but it wasn't her. The thing that returned wore her face, her clothes, but it wasn't my wife. She was cold, distant. Her voice was wrong, her smile forced, and when I looked into her eyes, I saw something dark, something old, something that didn't belong. Now I see what it is. It's the tree. It's part of the tree. They all are. The ones it brings back, they aren't human. They're bound to it, tied to its roots. I can hear it calling to me. It's not finished with me yet. I don't know how much longer I can resist. I have to warn the others. I have to... The entry ended abruptly, the ink trailing off as if the writer had been interrupted. Henry stared at the page, his hands shaking. He knew what had happened. The man had been claimed, just like the others, just like the people whose names were forgotten but whose souls were bound to the tree. Just like Henry would be. The realization hit him like a punch to the gut. He had asked for Mary, but the woman now living in his cabin wasn't her. It never had been. She was something else, something older, something bound to the wishing tree, just like the settlers had warned. She wore Mary's skin, spoke with her voice, but inside she was hollow. Henry swallowed hard, bile rising in his throat. His mind raced, his thoughts spiraling out of control. The tree had taken Mary from him once, and now it had given her back in a cruel mockery of what she had been. It wasn't her. It could never be her. He glanced back at the window. Mary was still standing there, unmoving, her back to him. She hadn't noticed his distress, hadn't reacted to anything. She was like a puppet, waiting for a string to be pulled. A cold, sickening fear spread through Henry's chest. He had to know. He had to confront her. He had to face whatever it was that had come back in Mary's place. He closed the journal, the warnings of the settlers echoing in his mind. His heart pounded as he stood, his legs weak beneath him. Slowly he made his way to the window, each step feeling like he was moving toward his own doom. "Mary," he whispered, his voice trembling, "turn around." For a long, agonizing moment, she didn't move. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. Then, slowly, she turned. Her face was pale in the moonlight, her eyes reflecting the light like glass. She stared at him, her expression empty, her lips twisted into a faint, unnatural smile. Henry's breath caught in his throat. It wasn't her. It had never been her. And now he knew what he had to do. The wind howled through the forest, carrying with it the sharp, biting cold of the mountains. The moon hung low, casting an eerie light over the trees, their twisted branches like skeletal fingers reaching for the stars. Henry's breath came in ragged bursts as he trudged through the thick underbrush, his eyes fixed on the path ahead. He could hear her following behind him, silent, patient, as though she already knew how this would end. The wishing tree. He could feel its pull, drawing him deeper into the woods, the weight of his fate pressing down on his shoulders like the oppressive silence of the forest. The tree was waiting for him, just as it had been waiting all along. It had given him what he asked for, and now it was time to pay the price. Behind him, the woman who wore Mary's face followed without a word. Her footsteps were slow, deliberate, like the creak of old floorboards in an empty house. Henry didn't need to look back to know she was watching him, her hollow eyes fixed on him with that same cold, lifeless stare. The realization had taken root inside him. This wasn't Mary. This thing, this creature, had come from the tree. It was part of it, and now it was claiming him. The forest opened up into a clearing, and there it stood, the ancient oak, its hollow gaping like a mouth in the center of its twisted trunk. The roots coiled and writhed beneath the ground, moving with a life of their own. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and rot. The tree was alive, more alive than anything Henry had ever seen, and it was hungry. Henry stopped at the edge of the clearing, his heart pounding in his chest. The journals had been right. The settlers had warned him, warned everyone, but he hadn't listened. Desperation had clouded his judgment, had made him blind to the truth. He had asked for Mary, begged for her to come back, but what the tree had given him wasn't a gift. It was a curse. He turned to face her. She stood just a few feet away, her pale skin glowing in the moonlight, her eyes dark and empty. Her hair hung limp around her face, and her lips, once so full of warmth and love, were pulled into a thin, lifeless line. She tilted her head slightly, as if waiting for him to speak, as if she already knew the words he was about to say. "You're not her," Henry whispered, his voice shaking. She didn't move. She didn't blink. "You're not Mary," he said again, louder this time, his voice filled with a mixture of anger and sorrow. "What are you?" The woman stared at him for a long moment, her face expressionless. Then slowly a smile crept across her lips, a cold, unnatural smile that sent a shiver down Henry's spine. "I am what you asked for," she said, her voice soft, barely more than a whisper. "I am what you wished." Henry's chest tightened. He could feel the roots of the tree beneath him, shifting, reaching. The forest seemed to close in around him, the shadows growing deeper, darker. The wind picked up, swirling around the clearing, but the woman didn't flinch. She stood there, as still as the tree, as though she was part of it. Henry's fists clenched at his sides. "No," he said, his voice trembling. "You're not her. You're something else. You're—" "I am Mary," she interrupted, her smile widening. "I am what is left of her." The words cut through him like a blade. He wanted to believe her, wanted to hold on to the hope that some part of Mary still existed in the creature standing before him. But he couldn't ignore the truth any longer. The woman who had returned to him wasn't his wife. She was something ancient, something dark, tied to the tree in ways he couldn't understand. The wind roared, the sound growing louder, like the breath of the earth itself, as the roots of the oak began to stir beneath the ground, writhing and twisting toward him. Henry's heart raced, panic rising in his throat. He backed away, but the roots followed, creeping closer, snaking through the earth like a predator stalking its prey. He turned to run, but she was there, Mary, or whatever wore her face, blocking his path. Her eyes gleamed in the moonlight, and for the first time since her return, he saw something in them. something dark and ancient, older than the mountains themselves. She stepped forward, and Henry could feel the pull of the tree behind him, the weight of the curse that had claimed them both. "You wanted her back," the woman said, her voice now low, resonant with something not entirely human. "You asked for her, and now you will stay with us." The roots surged forward, wrapping around Henry's legs, pulling him down. He struggled, his hands clawing at the earth, but it was no use. The tree had him now. The ancient oak groaned, its hollow expanding, its bark splitting and cracking as the roots coiled tighter around him. Henry gasped for breath, his body sinking into the ground, the cold earth swallowing him. He looked up at the woman, at the thing that had taken Mary's place. She watched him with that same cold, emotionless gaze, her smile never faltering. And as the roots tightened around his chest, Henry finally understood. The wishing tree didn't grant miracles. It took, it twisted, it consumed. "I'm sorry," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of the wind. "I'm so sorry, Mary." But Mary was gone. The roots dragged him down, deeper into the earth, the forest closing in around him. The last thing Henry saw before the darkness claimed him was the hollow of the tree, wide and gaping, waiting to swallow him whole. And then there was nothing. The wishing tree stood silent in the clearing, its roots still once more, its hollow dark and empty. The wind died down and the forest returned to its quiet, timeless vigil, as if nothing had happened at all. But deep within the oak, beneath the twisting roots and ancient bark, Henry's soul, like so many before him, was bound to the tree, a prisoner of his own wish. He had asked for Mary, and the tree had given him something else, something that would keep him with it forever. The wishing tree stood as it always had, waiting for the next desperate soul to whisper into its hollow, and the cycle would begin again.